My name is Tori, and I'm 28 years old. For as long as I can remember, my father made me feel like I didn't belong in my own family. He used to say I was too pretty to be his daughter. My blonde hair and blue eyes, in his mind, were proof that my mother had been unfaithful. He treated me like living proof of something she always said never happened. So when he told me he wouldn't walk me down the aisle unless I took a DNA test, I finally agreed. But the results didn't just prove he was wrong about my mother. They revealed something none of us were prepared for. I wasn't his daughter. And I wasn't my mother's daughter either. What we uncovered about the hospital where I was born changed everything. And by the time the truth came out, my father was on his knees in front of 60 relatives, unable to say a word. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories about hidden truths, family secrets, and moments that change everything, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly pulls you in. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back 6 weeks, to the night my father gave me his final condition. It happened during Sunday dinner at my parents' house in Fairfield, Connecticut. A 6-bedroom, Tudor-style home my father loved to describe as something he built with his own 2 hands. The dining room looked perfect, just like it always did. Polished furniture, fine china, crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier. My mother kept everything spotless, almost as if a flawless home could protect her from the pain inside it. My grandmother, Eleanor, sat at the far end of the table with her silver hair pinned back, watching my father closely. My brother Marcus, 31, the golden child of the family, kept his eyes fixed on his plate. My mother, Diane, held her linen napkin so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Then Gerald Townsend cleared his throat. "I won't be attending your wedding, Tori." The entire table went still. My mother's fork slipped from her hand and hit the plate. "Gerald," she whispered. "Please, not tonight." But he had already reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a folded document and slid it across the oak table toward me. "I've thought about this for a long time," he said calmly, like he had practiced every word. "I won't walk another man's daughter down the aisle, not until we settle this once and for all." I looked down at the paper. It was a consent form for a DNA paternity test from a local clinic. His signature was already at the bottom. "You have 6 weeks," Gerald continued. "Take the test. Share the results with the family. If you're mine, I'll be there. I'll even apologize." Then he smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "But we both know what the results will say." My grandmother's teacup hit the saucer with a sharp sound. My mother began crying silently, tears running down her face as if she had been holding them back for years. And I just sat there, staring at the Rolex on my father's wrist as it caught the chandelier light. 28 years. He had been waiting for this moment for 28 years. I didn't sign the paper that night. I didn't shout. I didn't leave the table. I only looked at him and said, "Thank you for reminding me who you are, Gerald. I'll remember this." And I meant every word. To understand why that dinner didn't shock me, you need to know something about my childhood. By the time I turned 28, I had learned that my father's coldness followed a pattern. It came back again and again, steady and relentless. I was 7 the first time I realized he saw me differently. I had pressed my ear against my parents' bedroom door after hearing my mother cry. That was when I heard him say, "Look at that blonde hair. Where did it come from, Diane? Certainly not from me." At 12, I wanted to join the school volleyball team. Gerald refused to sign the permission slip. "I'm not spending money on someone else's child," he told me. He said it right in front of Marcus, who got brand new baseball cleats that same week. At 18, Marcus went to Boston University. Gerald paid for everything: tuition, housing, meal plans, spending money. When I got accepted into nursing school, Gerald looked at me from across that same dining table and said, "Your real father can pay for yours." So I paid for it myself. I took out loans, I worked double shifts at a diner, I pushed through exhaustion and graduated 6 years later with $60,000 in debt and a degree I had earned completely on my own. But the hardest part was never the money. It was watching what his suspicions did to my mother. Every disagreement in that house somehow came back to me. Bills, vacations, Marcus's career, family plans. No matter where the conversation started, Gerald always found a way to bring it back to the idea that my mother had hidden something from him. I became his favorite argument, his constant reminder, his reason to punish her without ever saying it directly. The night before I left for college, my grandmother Eleanor pulled me aside. "Keep every document from the hospital where you were born," she said, gripping my wrist firmly. "Your birth certificate, any paperwork, anything with names or dates on it." I frowned. Why? She looked down the hallway, making sure no one was listening. "Because I have a feeling we may need them one day." I didn't understand what she meant back then, but I kept the papers, and 18 years later, I would finally learn why. That night, after Gerald's demand, I drove back to my apartment in Hartford. It was a small, one-bedroom place, filled with second-hand furniture and the kind of stubborn pride that comes from building a life without anyone's help. Nathan was waiting for me on the couch. His laptop was open, floor plans spread across the screen for one of his clients. On the coffee table were 2 glasses of wine, one for him and one for me. The moment he saw my face, he closed the laptop. He didn't ask what happened right away. He just stood up, walked over, and said, "Tell me everything." "What did he do this time?" I told Nathan everything. The DNA form, the condition, the 6-week deadline. With every word, his jaw tightened. "Maybe you should do it," he said finally. "Take the test. Prove him wrong once and for all. Let him have nowhere left to hide." I placed my wine glass on the coffee table. It was a cheap little glass from Target, nothing like the crystal my father loved to drink from. Then I looked down at the modest diamond on my finger. Nathan had designed the ring himself, based on a sketch I had drawn years earlier in an old journal. "It's not just about proving him wrong anymore," I said. "It's about setting my mother free." Nathan went quiet. He knew exactly what I meant. 5 years earlier, I had received a call from my grandmother at 2 in the morning. She had found my mother in a terrible state, and for a moment, we almost lost her. The paramedics arrived in time, but only just. After that night, Diane started therapy twice a week. She began taking prescribed medication. Slowly, carefully, she tried to put herself back together. Gerald never apologized. He never admitted what more than 2 decades of suspicion had done to her. He simply continued acting like he had been right all along. "My mother gave that man 35 years of loyalty," I told Nathan. "She gave him complete faithfulness. And he repaid her with 28 years of making her feel like she had to defend herself." I picked up my phone and opened the website of a genetics lab I had found months earlier. Gene Trust. Independent, certified, and most importantly, not connected to Gerald in any way. "I'll take the test," I said, "but I'll do it my way." 2 weeks later, Gerald turned 60. The party was held at the Fairfield Country Club. 18 holes of perfect green grass stretched toward Long Island Sound, and inside a private dining room with floor-to-ceiling windows, 30 relatives had gathered to celebrate the man who had made my mother's life feel smaller year after year. I wore a simple black dress. As Nathan and I walked in, he squeezed my hand and whispered, 2 hours. We can get through 2 hours. We couldn't. Halfway through dinner, after 3 glasses of expensive French wine, Gerald stood to give a speech. He thanked everyone for coming. He praised Marcus for his impressive finance career. He raised a glass to my mother and thanked her for her patience. Then his eyes found me. "I see my daughter is here tonight," he said. The way he said daughter made the word sound like a joke. A few relatives gave uncomfortable little laughs. "I hope she's been thinking about our conversation," he continued, "about proving where she really comes from." The room fell silent. "Dad," Marcus said, already halfway out of his chair, "maybe this isn't the time." Gerald waved him off. No, this is exactly the time. Family should be honest with each other." Then he looked at me with that cold smile I had seen too many times. "You know what they call a bird that leaves its egg in another bird's nest?" he asked. "A cuckoo. The egg may look beautiful, but it doesn't belong there. It never did." Somewhere behind me, an aunt gasped. A cousin let out a nervous laugh. My mother stared down at her lap. Tears fell onto the bracelet on her wrist, the expensive one Gerald had given her after one of their worst arguments, as if jewelry could erase pain. I picked up my fork. Then I set it down again. And I stood. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward me. "Thank you for reminding me who you are, Gerald," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'll remember this." Then I looked at my mother. "Mom, would you like to step outside for some air?" She took my hand. Together we walked out of that room, past the whispers, past the staring faces, past the man who had spent nearly 3 decades trying to break the 2 women who had loved him most. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. My grandmother caught up with us in the parking lot, her heels tapping sharply against the pavement. "Tori, wait!" I turned around. Eleanor Whitmore was 78 years old, with the posture of a queen and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She had never trusted Gerald. "That man thinks he's a gift to the world of engineering," she had once told my mother before the wedding. "But he's just a small man with an oversized ego." Now, though, my grandmother looked different. There was urgency in her face. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, glancing back toward the building to make sure Gerald hadn't followed. "Something I should have told you years ago." She led us to a bench overlooking the golf course. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The night you were born," she said, "something strange happened at St. Mary's Hospital." I felt my mother stiffen beside me. "When the nurse brought you out to show us, your grandfather was still alive then. We were both there. And that nurse looked terrified. Her hands were shaking. She handed you to Diane far too quickly, then rushed out of the room like she wanted to disappear." "Mom," Diane said, her voice breaking, "you never told me this." "I tried to ask questions," Eleanor said. "I called the hospital. I asked for answers. But they kept telling me everything was normal. They said the records were private and that there was nothing else to discuss." Then my grandmother reached into her purse and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper. "But before everything became difficult to access, I made a copy of your birth record." I looked down at the document. Time of birth, 11:47 p.m. My mother slowly shook her head. I gave birth at 11:58, she said. I remember looking at the clock. I remember because the doctor made a joke about you almost being born on leap day. 11 minutes. Somewhere inside those 11 minutes, something had happened. There's a name, my grandmother said. The head nurse on duty that night, Margaret Sullivan. She retired 10 years ago. I have her address. The next morning, I walked into Gene Trust's Hartford office with 3 DNA samples. Mine was simple, a cheek swab sealed in a sterile tube. My mother's was given willingly. She handed it to me the night before, tears in her eyes, but her hands steady. Whatever this shows, she told me, you are my daughter. Nothing will ever change that. My father's sample was different. I had taken a few strands of hair from the brush he kept in the guest bathroom, the same bathroom I had used every Thanksgiving and Christmas for years, pretending not to notice how he always seemed uncomfortable whenever I was near him. The technician at Gene Trust was a calm woman named Dr. Reyes. She explained everything clearly. Results would take 3 weeks. The report could be used legally if necessary. Everything would remain completely confidential. I paid extra to speed up the process. My grandmother insisted on covering the cost. That afternoon, I called Margaret Sullivan. The phone rang 6 times before someone finally answered. An older woman's voice came through the line, quiet and unsteady. Hello? Mrs. Sullivan? My name is Tori Townsend. I was born at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15, 1997. I believe you were the head nurse on duty that night, and I can't help you. The words came out too quickly, almost like she had been afraid of this call for years. Mrs. Sullivan, please, I only need to ask you a few questions. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. Please don't contact me again. Then the line went dead. I stared at my phone for a long moment. Nathan looked up from his drafting table. What happened? She ended the call, I said slowly, but not before she got scared. I set the phone down. She knows something, Nathan. She definitely knows something. A woman who had nothing to hide would have sounded confused. Margaret Sullivan sounded terrified. Whatever had happened at St. Mary's Hospital in 1997, she had been carrying it for 28 years. And now, somehow, I was carrying it too. 3 days later, the email arrived. Not to me directly. Gerald was never that subtle. He sent it to the entire extended family. Aunts, uncles, cousins, second cousins, and people I hadn't seen since childhood. 47 recipients. My mother, my grandmother, and I were all copied on it. The subject line read, Regarding Tori's wedding. I opened it in my car, parked outside the hospital where I worked, my hands trembling against the steering wheel. Dear family, as many of you know, I have carried a painful question for 28 years. I have lived with doubt about my daughter's true parentage and watched my wife refuse to be honest about the situation. I have asked Tori to take a DNA test and share the results with our family before her wedding. So far, she has refused, which I believe says enough. Until this matter is resolved publicly, I will not be attending the ceremony. I hope you will all understand my position. Attached is a family photograph from Tori's christening. I invite you to look closely and draw your own conclusions. Regards, Gerald Townsend. The attachment was a photo I knew well. It had sat on my grandmother's mantel for years. I was 3 months old, resting in my mother's arms. Blonde hair, blue eyes, pale skin. Around us stood Gerald, Marcus, and a crowd of brunette relatives. Gerald had circled my face in red. Underneath, he had added a caption: "Spot the difference." Within hours, the replies began pouring in. Some people defended my mother. Most just asked careful questions, pretending to be concerned while clearly wanting more details. That night, Marcus called me.
"Just do what Dad wants," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "You're making this worse. You're damaging his reputation."
I laughed. I actually laughed. "His reputation?" I repeated. "That's what you're worried about?" He ended the call without answering. 3 weeks after I submitted the samples, the email from Gene Trust arrived. It was 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Nathan was in Boston for work, helping with a project consultation that couldn't be moved. I was alone in our apartment, a half-eaten salad sitting on the coffee table, my laptop open to a show I hadn't really been watching. The subject line was cold and simple. "Your DNA analysis results. Secure document." I entered my password. I confirmed my identity. Then I opened the PDF. And I read the first page 3 times, because the words didn't make sense the first 2 times. Subject A, Tori Townsend, shows 0% genetic match with Subject B, Gerald Townsend. I had expected that. I had prepared for it. Part of me had even prepared for the painful possibility that Gerald had been right about one thing, even if he had been wrong about everything else. But then I read the next line. Subject A, Tori Townsend, shows 0% genetic match with Subject C, Diane Townsend. I couldn't move. 0%. Not my father's daughter. Not my mother's daughter. I called Gene Trust's after-hours number, my voice shaking as I asked to speak with someone, anyone, who could explain what I was reading. A technician walked me through the results. No contamination, no mix-up, no indication of an error. The samples were clean. The findings were clear. I was not biologically related to either of my parents, which meant my mother had never betrayed Gerald. He had spent 28 years accusing her of something she had not done. But it also meant something else, something impossible. If Diane Townsend had been faithful, just like she had always said, then how was I not her biological daughter? I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, my phone resting in my lap, staring up at the ceiling. For 28 years, my father had called my mother unfaithful. For 28 years, he had been wrong about her. But he had been right about one thing. I wasn't his daughter. Now there was only one question left. Whose daughter was I? The next morning, I drove to my parents' house. I timed my arrival carefully. 10 in the morning, late enough for Gerald to be at his golf game, early enough for my mother to still be in her robe, drinking Earl Grey in the sunroom. She looked up the moment I walked in, and concern immediately crossed her face. "Tori, what's wrong?" I sat down across from her and handed her my phone. The Gene Trust report was already open on the screen. I watched her read it. I watched the color slowly leave her face. Her lips moved silently as her eyes went over the numbers again and again, as if reading them one more time might make them change. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were filled with panic. "This is wrong," she whispered. "This has to be wrong." "I called the lab," I said quietly. "I asked them to check everything. More than once. There's no mistake, Mom." "But I gave birth to you." Her voice rose, breaking at the edges. "I was in labor for 14 hours. I felt you come into the world. I saw you, Tori. You were red-faced, crying, and you were mine." I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. They were ice cold. "I believe you," I said. "And that means there's only one explanation. She stared at me. "Something happened at the hospital," I said. "Someone switched us." The silence between us stretched so tightly it felt like it might snap. Then my mother's eyes changed. "The time," she said suddenly. "The birth certificate says 11:47, but I remember watching the clock because the contractions were so intense. You were born at 11:58. I always wondered why the time was different." 11 minutes. Just 11 minutes. And somehow, those 11 minutes had changed two families forever. "Mom," I said carefully, "if I'm not your biological daughter, then that means your real daughter is somewhere out there." She covered her mouth. "She's 28 years old," I continued, "living someone else's life." That was when my mother broke down. Not the quiet tears Gerald always pulled out of her. These were deep, shaking sobs, the kind that came from a place words could never reach. "We have to find her," she managed to say. "We have to find them both." I need to pause here for a moment. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like you didn't belong in your own family, like your very existence made people question you, I want you to know something. I see you. And this story is far from over, because the truth was about to become even more complicated. If you're invested in finding out what really happened at that hospital, make sure you're subscribed. And tell me in the comments what you think happened that night. Now let me tell you about the nurse who finally broke her silence. Gerald found out about the DNA test before I had time to prepare. Marcus, always the loyal son, saw the Gene Trust confirmation email on my mother's phone while visiting her for lunch. Within an hour, my phone rang. Gerald's voice was already full of victory before I even said hello. "So," he said, "what did it say? Was I right?" I didn't answer. I didn't know how to explain that he had been right and wrong at the exact same time. But my silence told him enough. "I knew it," he said. Then he laughed. Not nervously, not softly. He laughed like a man who believed the world had finally handed him a trophy. 28 years, Tori. 28 years I've been saying it, and no one believed me. But I was right. I was right all along." "Gerald, does your mother know?" "Yes. She knows."
"Of course she does," he said. "She's probably crying right now, trying to figure out how to explain this away."
I could hear him pacing. He sounded almost excited.
"I'm sending another email to everyone," he continued, this time with proof. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly. You're not my daughter. Your mother misled me for almost 3 decades, and now everyone will know exactly what kind of woman Diane Townsend really is." He ended the call before I could tell him the truth. Before I could explain that Diane hadn't misled anyone, that she had been telling the truth all along, that the real story was bigger than any of us had imagined. Within the hour, Gerald called my mother and told her to pack her things. "I want you out of my house by the end of the month," he said. "I'm done with your lies." My grandmother drove over immediately to stay with her. When I arrived that evening, I found them both in the living room. My mother was curled into the couch, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. My grandmother stood nearby like a silver-haired guard, ready to take on the entire world if she had to. "He thinks he won," I said quietly. My grandmother looked at me with those sharp, knowing eyes.
"Then let's show him the rest of the story."
The next 3 days were some of the hardest of my life. I thought about postponing the wedding.
Not because of Gerald, but because I couldn't stand the thought of my mother's truth being buried underneath white fabric, flowers, and champagne toasts. Nathan refused. "We are getting married," he said, holding my face gently in his hands. "Your father's behavior does not get to control our future. We are not pausing our life because he decided to create chaos." But I couldn't move forward without answers. And the truth was locked inside Margaret Sullivan's memory. I called her again and again, 5 times in 3 days. Every call went straight to voicemail. On the 6th try, I left a different message. "Mrs. Sullivan, my name is Tori Townsend. I know you remember that name. I have certified DNA evidence proving that a baby was switched at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15th, 1997. I paused, trying to steady my voice. "I'm not calling to blame you. I'm not calling to attack anyone. I just need to know who I am." I took a breath. "But if you don't call me back, my next step will be legal. I'll request the hospital records. I'll ask for a formal review. And whatever has been hidden for 28 years will come out in the most difficult way possible." Then I hung up. I waited 1 hour, then 2. At 4:17 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Thursday, 2 p.m., Riverside Diner, Bridgeport. Come alone." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I texted back, "I'll be there." Whatever Margaret Sullivan had been carrying for 28 years, she was finally ready to let it go. The question was whether I was ready to hear it. Riverside Diner was the kind of place that felt untouched by time. The vinyl booths were patched with duct tape, the jukebox looked like it only knew songs from another century, and the coffee tasted like it had been sitting there far longer than anyone wanted to admit. Margaret Sullivan was sitting in the corner booth with her back against the wall. She was 72, smaller than I had imagined, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and hands that trembled around her coffee cup. She looked up when I slid into the seat across from her. "You look just like her," she said quietly. My breath caught. "Like who?" "Linda," she whispered. "Your biological mother. Same hair, same eyes." For a moment, the whole diner seemed to fade around me. "You know who my biological mother is?" Margaret closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, they were shining with tears. "I've carried this for 28 years, she said. "Every single day, wondering if I made the right choice by staying quiet. Wondering if I should have spoken up the moment it happened." She reached into her purse and pulled out an old leather journal. The cover was worn, and the pages had yellowed with age. "This is my shift log from March 15th, 1997, she said, "the night you were born." She opened it to a marked page and slid it across the table. I looked down at her handwriting, small and cramped, and felt my stomach tighten with every line. 11:47 p.m. Baby girl number 1, born to Diane Townsend, healthy, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. 11:58 p.m. Baby girl number 2, born to Linda Morrison, healthy, 6 pounds, 4 ounces. 12:32 a.m. Incident noted. Trainee nurse Carla Harris mixed up infants after bathing. 2:15 a.m. Error confirmed. Both families had already received and bonded with infants. 2:45 a.m. Meeting with hospital administrator. Decision made to correct records, not families. Considered less disruptive for all involved. Confidentiality agreement required for all staff present. I looked up at Margaret, my hands unsteady. They knew, I whispered. They knew that same night, and they covered it up. Margaret's face crumpled. The administrator said changing everything back would cause more pain. Both mothers had already held their babies, fed them, named them. Her voice cracked. I was 24 years old. They told me my career would be over if I spoke. They said I could lose everything. I had 2 children of my own to take care of. I could barely get the next words out. Who was the other baby? The one who went home with Linda Morrison? Margaret reached into her purse again and pulled out a printed page from a social media profile. A woman my age stared back at me. Brown hair, brown eyes, a warm smile. A smile that looked almost exactly like Marcus's. Her name is Rachel Morrison, Margaret said. She's 28 years old. She lives in Springfield, Massachusetts. Then she looked at me with 28 years of guilt in her eyes. And she is your mother's biological daughter. That night, I sat in my apartment with my laptop open to Rachel Morrison's LinkedIn profile. Elementary school teacher at Springfield Public Schools, graduate of UMass Amherst, volunteer at a local animal shelter. Her profile picture showed her standing in front of a classroom decorated with bright alphabet letters and children's artwork. She had chestnut brown hair, warm brown eyes, and the kind of smile that made her look instantly familiar. She looked like Marcus. She looked like my family. Or at least, the family I had spent my whole life trying to belong to. I wrote the message 17 different times before I finally pressed send. Hi, Rachel. This is going to sound unbelievable, and I'm sorry for how sudden this message is. My name is Tori Townsend. I was born at St. Mary's Hospital in Bridgeport, Connecticut on March 15, 1997. From what I've learned, you were born there on the same night. I recently took a DNA test that showed I'm not biologically related to either of my parents. Since then, I spoke with a nurse who worked that night, and she confirmed that 2 newborns were accidentally switched. I believe you may be the biological daughter of Diane and Gerald Townsend, and I believe I may be the biological daughter of Linda Morrison. I have documentation. I have a witness statement. I'm not asking anything from you. I only believe you deserve to know the truth. If you're willing to talk, please call me. I included my phone number. Then I closed the laptop before I could talk myself out of it. 24 hours passed. I checked my phone every 10 minutes, like I was waiting for news that could change the entire shape of my life. Then, at 9:38 the next night, my phone rang. I stared at the unknown number for 3 seconds before answering. Hello? Is this Tori? The voice on the other end was shaky and uncertain, but something about it felt familiar. Rachel? There was a long pause, then a trembling breath. My whole life, she said. People have told me I don't look like my parents. My dad, well, my legal dad, used to joke that maybe the hospital made a mistake. She let out a sound that was almost a laugh, but not quite. We all laughed about it. I guess it wasn't really a joke after all. We talked for 3 hours that night. By the end of the call, we had both agreed to take another DNA test. This one would compare Rachel directly to Gerald and Diane. The results would be ready in 10 days, just in time for my engagement party. Over the next week, I built my case piece by piece. First, the documents. I had my original gene trust report showing a 0% genetic match with both Gerald and Diane. I had photographs of Margaret Sullivan's handwritten shift log from 1997, which she had finally agreed to let me copy. And I had a notarized statement from Margaret, signed in front of a witness at her attorney's office. She told me it was her own decision, her chance to finally clear her conscience. "The hospital kept me quiet for 28 years, she said when I picked up the document. "I'm 72 now," Margaret said with a tired little smile. "What are they going to do? End my retirement?" Second came the DNA. Rachel had submitted her sample to GeneTrust using the same expedited process I had. Her results comparing her to Gerald and Diane were scheduled to arrive 2 days before the engagement party. Third came the witnesses. My grandmother Eleanor would be there, of course. She had been waiting 28 years for this moment. Margaret Sullivan agreed to attend too. She would sit quietly in the corner until she was needed. And Rachel, the woman who should have grown up beside me in some version of life, would be waiting in the room next door. "Are you sure about this?" Nathan asked as we went over the plan together. Confronting him in front of everyone. Once it happens, there's no going back. I thought about my mother. I thought about the night we almost lost her. I thought about 28 years of Gerald making her defend herself against something she had never done. "He wanted a public reckoning," I said. "He sent that email to 47 people. He humiliated me in front of the family. He questioned my mother for nearly 3 decades. I straightened the stack of documents on my desk. He doesn't get to walk away quietly now. Everyone who believed him needs to see the truth." Nathan nodded slowly. "Then let's give them a night they'll never forget." 3 days before the engagement party, Rachel's DNA results arrived. Subject A, Rachel Morrison, shows a 99.97% genetic match with Subject B, Gerald Townsend. Subject A, Rachel Morrison, shows a 99.98% genetic match with Subject C, Diane Townsend. I read the numbers 3 times, tears sliding down my face. Then I called Rachel. "Can you meet me tomorrow? In person?" We chose a Starbucks halfway between Hartford and Springfield. Neutral ground for 2 women whose lives had just been rewritten by science. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 untouched lattes in front of her. When she saw me, she stood so quickly her chair almost tipped over. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. We just looked at each other. She had brown hair, brown eyes, and a strong jawline I had seen on Marcus 1,000 times. There was a small dimple in her left cheek, the same one Gerald had. And I had blonde hair, blue eyes, a small button nose, and fair skin that matched the photos Margaret had shown me of Linda Morrison. We were strangers who should have been raised like sisters, 2 lives placed into the wrong homes before either of us could even open our eyes. "This is so strange," Rachel whispered. Then she laughed, and I laughed too. A second later, we were hugging in the middle of Starbucks, crying into each other's shoulders while the baristas politely pretended not to notice. "I want to meet them," Rachel said when we finally stepped back from each other. "Diane and Gerald, my biological parents." "You will," I promised, "in 3 days." I didn't tell her that one of those parents would be completely broken by the time she walked into the room. The engagement party was held at Whitmore Estate, my grandmother's family home. It was a Georgian manor surrounded by rose gardens, with fairy lights woven through century-old oak trees. Grandmother had insisted on hosting. "You deserve a proper celebration," she told me, "in a place where Gerald's ego cannot reach." 60 guests arrived that evening in cocktail attire. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends, and every single person who had received Gerald's email. I wore a navy blue dress and carried myself like a woman who already knew how the night would end. Nathan stayed close, his hand resting gently on my lower back, steady as always. My mother arrived with my grandmother. Her eyes were still red from days of crying, but her posture was straighter than I had seen it in years. Something had changed in her since we discovered the truth. Even before anyone else knew, the weight had already started to lift. And then Gerald arrived. Late, of course. He would have called it fashionable. He let the room fill first, let the attention build, let people notice him when he finally walked in. He wore a perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit, his Rolex catching the chandelier light, and a smug little smile resting at the corners of his mouth. He thought this was his victory lap. He had no idea. I watched him move through the room, shaking hands and accepting sympathetic looks from relatives who still believed his version of the story. "Such a difficult situation," I heard one aunt murmur to him. "You've been so patient." Marcus stood beside him, visibly uncomfortable but still obedient. The loyal son, the perfect soldier. In the corner of the room, Margaret Sullivan sat quietly with a glass of water, her hands trembling even after all these years. And in the room next door, behind a side door connected to the main hall, Rachel Morrison waited for her cue. I checked my phone. Nathan gave me a small nod. It was time. Halfway through cocktail hour, Gerald asked for a microphone. The room quieted as he stepped onto the small, raised platform my grandmother had set up for toasts. He cleared his throat, adjusted his jacket, and smiled at the crowd like a man who thought he owned the room. "First, I'd like to congratulate Nathan," he began. "You're a brave man marrying into this complicated family." A few nervous laughs moved through the guests. "But I think we all know why I'm really standing here." Gerald's eyes found me in the crowd, and something cold passed through his expression. "There has been a lot of talk lately," he continued. "A lot of speculation. I asked Tori to take a DNA test, and I know she did. What I don't know is why she has been hiding the results." The room went completely still. "So I thought I would help her." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "My son was kind enough to share a copy of the report with me." Marcus, at least, had the decency to look ashamed. Gerald unfolded the paper slowly, turning the moment into a performance. 0% genetic match with Gerald Townsend," he read. A wave of whispers moved through the room. 0% genetic match with Diane Townsend. The whispers turned into gasps. My mother gripped Eleanor's hand. 28 years, Gerald said, his voice rising with satisfaction. 28 years I have been telling everyone that something was wrong. And now the science proves it. Then he turned toward my mother. His face carried nearly 3 decades of bitterness. "You misled me, Diane. You misled everyone. And now the whole family knows the truth about you." The silence that followed was absolute. And then I began walking toward the stage. "You're right, Gerald." My voice was calm as I stepped onto the platform and took the microphone from his hand. He was so surprised that he let me. "The DNA test does show that I'm not your biological daughter," I said. "And it also shows that I'm not Mom's biological daughter either." Gerald's smirk widened. A few relatives exchanged looks, thinking they already knew what came next. But not because Mom was unfaithful.
His smile faltered. I turned to face the room. All 60 people. Every person who had received that email. Every relative who had whispered about my mother. Every person who thought they had already heard the whole story. Let me introduce you to someone. I nodded toward the side door. Rachel stepped into the room. 28 years old. Brown hair. Brown eyes. A jawline that was unmistakably, undeniably Townsend. The room erupted into shocked murmurs. Someone dropped a champagne glass. Marcus made a sound like the air had left his lungs. "This is Rachel Morrison," I said. She was born at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15, 1997. 11 minutes before me. I paused just long enough for everyone to understand that the timeline mattered. The night I was born, there was an error. A trainee nurse mixed up 2 newborns after bathing them.
The hospital discovered what happened that same night, but instead of telling the families, they chose to alter the records and keep it quiet. I took out my phone and tapped the screen. The wall-mounted display I had arranged earlier flickered to life. The Gene Trust reports appeared for everyone to see. Rachel's DNA shows a 99.97% genetic match with Gerald Townsend, I said. Then I looked at my mother. And a 99.98% genetic match with Diane Townsend. I let the silence settle over the room. Then I turned back to Gerald. "She is your biological daughter, Gerald." The daughter you had been looking for was standing right there. And she had spent her entire life in Massachusetts because a hospital made a mistake and then chose to keep it hidden. Gerald's face turned pale. For the first time, he truly looked at Rachel, not as a stranger, not as an interruption, but as a reflection of himself. And I watched 28 years of certainty begin to fall apart. "This is Margaret Sullivan," I continued, as Margaret slowly rose from her seat in the corner. She was the head nurse on duty that night. She has provided a notarized statement confirming everything I've just told you. The shift logs, the hospital's decision, all of it. Margaret stepped forward. Her voice trembled, but every word was clear. "Mr. Townsend, I was there," she said. "I saw what happened. Your wife never misled you. Never. The hospital required us to sign confidentiality agreements. They made it very clear that speaking out would cost us our careers. I am sorry I didn't come forward sooner." I turned back to Gerald. His hands were gripping the edge of the platform like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "You wanted science, Gerald," I said. "Here it is. Every document, every signature, every one of those 11 minutes that changed 2 families forever." And in that moment, standing on that stage with Rachel beside me, I felt something I had never felt in 28 years. Not victory for myself, vindication for my mother, for every tear she had cried, for every accusation she had been forced to carry, for every sleepless night she spent wondering if the man she loved would ever believe her. If this story is resonating with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the truth takes years to rise to the surface. Sometimes it takes decades. Now let me tell you what happened when Gerald finally understood what he had done. Gerald Townsend had spent 28 years being certain that his wife had hidden something from him, certain that I was proof of it, certain that his suspicions made him right, that his coldness was justified, that one day science would prove him correct. And now science had spoken, but it had not saved him. It had taken apart every belief he had built his life around. He looked at Rachel, this woman with his jawline, his eyes, his blood. and something inside him seemed to break. Then he looked at the DNA results on the screen. The numbers that proved he had been right about one thing, but deeply wrong about everything that mattered. Then he looked at Margaret Sullivan, whose trembling testimony had just undone 28 years of blame, and his knees gave out. Gerald Townsend, proud, polished, untouchable Gerald Townsend, sank down onto the platform like a man who no longer knew how to stand. He caught himself on one knee, his hands pressed against the hardwood floor, his breathing uneven. "I didn't know," he whispered. "How could I have known? How?" "You could have trusted her." My voice was quiet, but in that silent room, everyone heard it. "You could have asked questions. You could have searched for another explanation. You could have looked beyond your own suspicion and believed the woman who loved you." "But the hair," he said weakly. "The eyes." "Genetics are complicated," I said. "Family traits don't always show up the way people expect, and hospitals can make mistakes." I stepped closer and looked down at the man who had turned my childhood into a place where I always had to prove I belonged. "But you chose suspicion. You chose coldness. For 28 years, you punished Mom and me for something that never happened." Across the room, a chair scraped against the floor. Marcus stood up. Silent, loyal Marcus. For 1 second, I thought he was going to defend Gerald, like he always had. But he didn't. He walked right past his father without even looking at him and crossed the room to our mother. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I should have said something years ago. I should have done more." Diane pulled him into her arms, and Gerald remained on one knee, watching his family choose each other instead of him. For 28 years, my mother had lived under Gerald Townsend's shadow. She had carried his doubts at breakfast, at dinner, at family holidays, and in every quiet moment in between. She had cried herself to sleep more nights than anyone knew. She had absorbed his words and told herself that maybe, one day, he would finally see the truth. Now the truth was everywhere, on screens, in documents, in the voice of a nurse who had finally spoken, and in the face of a woman who carried Diane's blood. My mother stepped forward slowly. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor, and the crowd parted for her. Even Marcus moved aside. She stopped in front of Gerald, who was still down on one knee, his face wet with tears I had never seen from him before. 28 years, Gerald." Her voice was steady, stronger than I had ever heard it. 28 years. I stayed because I loved you, because I believed that one day you would trust me, because I thought this family was worth fighting for. Gerald looked up at her. "Diane, She raised one hand. "Not yet." The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "You don't get to apologize yet." Gerald froze. "You owe me an apology in front of every person who received that email," she said. "You owe Tori an apology for every birthday you made harder, every graduation you ignored, every moment you made her feel like a guest in her own family." Then she turned slightly toward Rachel, who stood near the door, overwhelmed and silent. "And you owe Rachel an apology too, for being the father she should have known, but never did." Gerald's shoulders shook. "I didn't need the whole world to believe me, Gerald," my mother said, her voice breaking only at the end. "I needed you to believe me. And you never did." Then she turned away from him and walked toward Rachel.
Rachel stood frozen, tears in her eyes. My mother stopped in front of her. "Hello," Diane said softly. "I'm your mother, and I am so sorry it took this long to find you." It took Gerald 3 attempts to stand. Marcus didn't help him. Neither did I. Neither did anyone in that room full of relatives who, just 10 minutes earlier, had believed his version of the story. Gerald gripped the edge of the platform and pulled himself upright. Then he reached for the microphone I had set down. When he spoke, his voice barely sounded like his own. It was rough, broken, stripped of every ounce of arrogance I had known my entire life. I was wrong. 3 words, 28 years overdue. I was wrong about Diane, he continued. She never. His voice cracked. He swallowed and tried again. She never misled me. I accused her for nearly 3 decades, and I was wrong. Then he looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes that was not suspicion. Tori, he said, I took things from you that I can never give back. Your childhood, your trust, the support you should have had. He paused, struggling to hold himself together. The money that should have been yours. He swallowed hard. I'll repay your student loans. All of them. It's not enough, I know that. But it's a start. Then he turned to Rachel, a stranger, his daughter, a woman he had never held, never raised, never comforted, and never had the chance to disappoint. I don't know what to say to you, he said, his voice barely holding together. You're my daughter, and I never knew. I missed everything. Your first steps, your school years, your graduations, your entire life. His voice broke completely. That is something I will regret for the rest of my life. Rachel was crying too. By then, we all were. But somehow, her voice stayed steady. We can start now, she said. If you're willing to be a father instead of a judge. Gerald nodded, unable to speak. My grandmother stepped forward and handed him a tissue from her purse. Clean yourself up, Gerald, she said, not unkindly. You have a lot of work ahead of you. 1 week after the engagement party, I drove to Springfield, Massachusetts.
Linda Morrison's house was a modest colonial in a quiet suburb. White siding, blue shutters, a garden full of wildflowers that had clearly been someone's labor of love. It was nothing like my grandmother's estate or Gerald's Tudor mansion, but it felt warm in a way those houses never quite had. Linda opened the door before I could knock. She was 56 years old, with blonde hair touched with silver, and blue eyes that looked exactly like mine. Seeing her felt like looking into the future, like standing face to face with the woman I might become in 30 years. Tori. Her voice caught on my name. I've been looking at your picture all week, she said. I kept thinking I must be dreaming. Then she pulled me into her arms. She smelled like lavender and something else I couldn't name, something that felt impossibly close to home. We sat in her kitchen for 4 hours. She showed me photographs from her childhood, pictures of my biological grandparents, who had passed years before I ever knew they existed, snapshots of a life I might have lived if one mistake at a hospital had not sent me down another path. She told me about her former husband, David, my biological father, who had passed after a long illness 3 years earlier, never knowing that Rachel was not biologically his. He used to say Rachel had old soul eyes, Linda said, wiping her tears with a kitchen towel. Now I understand why. She looked at me. They were your eyes, Tori. They were always your eyes. I showed her pictures from my childhood, too. The blonde baby in a house full of brunettes. The little girl who never quite fit. The grown woman who had finally discovered why. I don't want to replace Diane, Linda said gently. She raised you. She is your mother. She is, I said. Then I smiled through my tears. But maybe there's room for one more. Linda's smile could have lit the entire house. I'd like that, she said. I'd like that very much. 2 months later, I married Nathan Miller in the rose garden at Whitmore Estate, surrounded by fairy lights and family. The family I was born into, and the family that raised me. My mother walked me down the aisle. Not Gerald, my mother. She wore a champagne-colored dress and held her head high. Her steps were steady in a way I hadn't seen in decades. Beside her, I wore a Vera Wang gown that she and my grandmother had insisted on buying for me. A proper wedding dress for a proper wedding, Eleanor had declared. Gerald sat in the second row, quiet and smaller somehow. He didn't object when I told him he wouldn't be walking me down the aisle. He didn't argue when I explained that this moment belonged to my mother, not to him. He simply nodded and said, I understand. It was a start. Rachel stood with my bridesmaids in a deep green dress that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes. Our mother's eyes. Gerald's eyes. In the weeks after the party, she had begun getting to know the Townsends properly. Lunches that started awkwardly. Careful conversations. Small steps towards something that might one day feel like family. Linda Morrison sat in the front row of the guest section, in a place of honor. When she caught my eye, she waved softly, her own eyes bright with tears. Then my grandmother rose to give a toast. This wedding is not only about 2 people, Eleanor said, lifting her champagne glass. It is about 2 families finally finding their way back to the truth. It is about a daughter who refused to accept a lie, and a mother who waited 28 years to be believed. She looked at me, then at Rachel, then at Diane. To the truth, she said, however long it takes. To the truth, the room echoed, and I drank to that. The legal case took 8 months. Rachel and I filed together against St. Mary's Hospital, represented by a medical negligence attorney my grandmother had found. She specialized in cases involving serious hospital errors, and with a thin smile, she told us she had a particular interest in institutions that believed they could hide their mistakes. Margaret Sullivan gave her testimony. Her notarized statement was supported by the original shift log she had kept hidden for 28 years. The hospital's lawyers tried to challenge her credibility. They pointed to her age, the confidentiality agreement, and the fact that she had waited so long to come forward. It didn't work. During the evidence review, internal documents surfaced, emails between hospital administrators discussing what happened that night, memos about risk management, a budget line labeled potential liability settlement that had quietly been renewed every year since 1997. They had known. They had always known. And they had spent nearly 3 decades hoping no one would ever discover it. In the end, the hospital chose to settle rather than stand in front of a jury. $450,000 to each family. $900,000 total. A public apology printed in the local newspaper. Required improvements to their newborn identification procedures, and the resignation of the administrator who had made the decision to keep everything quiet. He had been retired for years, but now, for the first time, his name was public. We didn't take legal action for payback, I told a reporter who met us outside the courthouse. We did it so no other family would spend 28 years living a version of life that could have been corrected in a single day. Margaret Sullivan was granted protection from personal liability in exchange for her cooperation. A week later, she sent me a card. Her handwriting was shaky, but clear. "Thank you for giving me a reason to finally tell the truth. I can rest now." I kept that card in the same drawer as my birth certificate, the real one, the one that said 11:58 p.m., the one that finally told the truth. 6 months after the wedding, Gerald invited me to dinner, just the two of us. He chose a quiet Italian restaurant in downtown Hartford, not the country club, not some place designed to impress people. Just a corner booth with checkered tablecloths, small candles, and wine bottles lined along the walls. He looked older than he had at my engagement party. Grayer. Smaller somehow. As if the weight of everything he had finally admitted had changed him physically. "I wanted to thank you," he said after we ordered, "for agreeing to see me." "You're not my biological father," I said. "You never were. But you did raise me, even if you did it badly." He flinched, but he nodded. "I'm in therapy now," he said. "Diane insisted. Well, strongly suggested." He gave a small, tired smile. "We're doing couples counseling, too. We've been separated, but we're trying to—" His voice faded as he searched for the right words. "We're trying to see if there's anything left to rebuild." I thought about my mother, about the way she had stood in front of him at the party and demanded the apology she had deserved for decades, about how much strength it must have taken to even consider rebuilding after everything he had put her through. "I remember when you taught me to ride a bike," I said. "I was 5. Before you knew about the doubt, before you decided I wasn't yours. You held the seat and ran beside me for almost an hour until I finally got it." Gerald's eyes filled with tears. "I remember," he whispered. "That's the father I needed," I said. "The one who held on." He looked down at his hands. "I'm willing to try, Gerald. But I need you to understand something. Forgiveness is a process. It isn't one dinner. It isn't one apology. And you still have a lot of work to do." He nodded. "I know. And I'll do it. However long it takes." I didn't forgive him that night. I'm still not sure I've fully forgiven him. But I chose to give him the chance my mother never got. The chance to prove he could change. Rachel and Marcus met properly for the first time at a family dinner 1 month after the wedding. At first, it was awkward. Because how do you make small talk with the sibling you should have grown up with? The brother who had lived the childhood that, in another version of life, might have been shared with you. Then Marcus mentioned he was allergic to shellfish. Rachel froze. "Wait," she said. "Me too, since birth. The doctor said it was probably genetic." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "What about being left-handed?" Rachel lifted her left hand. "No way!" Marcus laughed. A real laugh. Surprised, bright, and delighted. "What about music?" he asked. "What bands do you listen to?" 30 minutes later, they discovered they both loved the same obscure indie folk band that no one else in either family had ever heard of. They both strongly disliked cilantro for reasons neither could explain. And they both tapped their right foot when they were deep in thought. "This is so strange," Marcus said, shaking his head. "You're like a mirror, just, a girl version." "I was going to say shorter," Rachel replied. Marcus threw a bread roll at her. And for the first time I could remember, a Townsend family dinner was filled with real laughter. Not the polite, careful kind my mother had always tried so hard to create. Real laughter. The kind that comes from people who actually want to be in the same room. It was a small moment, but it felt like the beginning of something new. 3 months after the wedding, Diane and Linda met for lunch. I wasn't there, but my mother told me about it later, her voice soft with wonder. They chose a cafe halfway between their homes, neutral ground, just like Rachel and I had done months before. Linda brought photos of Rachel's childhood. Diane brought photos of mine. They sat together for 3 hours, trading stories about the daughters they had raised, even though neither had given birth to the daughter she brought home. She told me about Rachel's first words, Diane said, and I told her about yours. She smiled through tears. We both cried a lot. Was it strange? I asked. Meeting the woman who raised your biological daughter? My mother thought about that for a long moment. I thought it would be, she admitted. I thought I might feel jealous or hurt or resentful. But when I looked at her, all I could think was, she loved Rachel the same way I loved you, completely, without question. Then she reached across the table and took my hand. We lost 28 years, she said. But we gained each other, and we gained the truth. That has to count for something. Linda and Diane have lunch together once a month now. They have become friends. An unlikely friendship, born from shared loss and an unexpected connection. They call each other the other mother. And in a strange way, I think it has helped both of them heal. I'm sitting in our new apartment now, a 2-bedroom in a nicer part of Hartford, with enough space for Nathan's home office and the nursery we'll need soon. The walls are covered with photographs. My wedding day, with Diane on one side of me and Linda Morrison on the other. Rachel and me at Thanksgiving, our first holiday together. My grandmother Eleanor looking completely victorious at her birthday party last month. Nathan is in the kitchen making dinner. Something complicated with too many ingredients. He has been on a cooking kick lately. And I've been thinking a lot about the past year. About identity. About family. About what it really means to belong. For 28 years, I tried to prove I was a Townsend. I straightened my blonde hair to make it look darker. I learned to play golf because Gerald loved golf. I chose nursing instead of art because nursing was practical, stable, respectable. I spent my whole life trying to fit into a shape that was never made for me. Now I understand why I never fit. I was someone else's daughter, living inside someone else's family story, carrying DNA no one around me recognized. But here's what I've learned. DNA does not make a family. The woman who held my hand after nightmares, who taught me to read, who stayed far longer than she should have because she believed our family was worth saving, that is my mother. Not because of biology, because of love. Nathan walks in carrying 2 plates and wearing a knowing smile. You're doing that thing again, he says. What thing? The deep thinking while staring at nothing thing? I laugh and take the plate from him. On the coffee table, tucked between a stack of baby name books and a pregnancy journal, is the test I took this morning. Positive. I don't know whose features this baby will carry. Mine, Nathan's, some echo of the Morrisons, some distant trace of the Townsends. But I know one thing for certain. This child will know they are loved from the very first moment, without conditions, without suspicion, without having to prove anything. And in the end, that is the only proof that matters. If you're watching this and you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, by a parent, a partner, or anyone who should have trusted you, I want you to remember this. The truth has a way of rising to the surface. Sometimes it takes days, sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes nearly 3 decades. But when it finally arrives, it doesn't just reveal what happened, it reveals who was willing to love you before they had proof. And those are the people who were your family all along. Sometimes it takes 28 years. Sometimes it takes a DNA test, a hidden record, and one brave nurse who can't carry the truth anymore. But eventually, the truth finds its way to the surface. So please, don't let someone else's suspicion decide your value. And if you are the one holding on to doubt, ask yourself one question. Is being certain worth breaking the people who love you? My father spent 28 years believing he was right. He was certain my mother had betrayed him. He was certain I didn't belong to him. He was certain that the way he treated us was justified. And in the end, he was wrong about all of it. Trust is a choice. Doubt is easy. But 28 years of doubt can tear a family apart. 28 years of trust could have saved mine. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And check the description for more stories like this one. Until next time, trust the truth, even when it takes a lifetime to find you.